Welcome back, folks. I'm J.B. Shreve, your host at The End of History, where we help believers make sense of the world they live in with intelligent, faith-based perspectives of our times and the history that built those times. In our last episode in this series, we looked at the role that ideas, specifically Enlightenment ideas, played in the shaping of the American colonies. Their vision of truth, their vision of justice. We saw how these ideas spread, how they became common sense in the early American mindset. Today, we're going to look at the Imperial crisis. This is where Britain and the Americans slowly began to realize, starting around 1763, how vast the divide between their views of the world had become. There was more than an ocean separating the British colonies from the European continent by this time. If you've not signed up to be a Patreon supporter yet, I encourage you to head over to our website, theendofhistory.net or jbshreve.com. You can sign up today for as little as $1 a month. You can help support this podcast and also access literally hundreds of prior episodes and series that we've published here since 2012. Okay, let's go ahead and jump into our next episode, The Imperial Crisis, part of our ongoing series, The Empire, a 250-year American story.
This is the end of history.
A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies.
We believe that peace is at hand.
An axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Democracy and freedom for all. We must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
So the turning point, the point at which the English Parliament and the American colonists began waking up to the reality that there was more than the Atlantic Ocean separating them in their mindsets and their perspectives. It came in 1763 and what was called the Imperial Crisis. That's the year that marked the onset of the Imperial Crisis. The French and Indian War had just ended, and the British people had spent a fortune in winning that war, and the British government had made a bunch of treaties and agreements with different Indian tribes along the American frontier on the western side of the colonies. Now, from the British perspective, it was time for the British to start organizing and paying for all of this war, paying for all of the victories that they had won. So in 1763, King George III of Britain, he takes a pen to a map, and he drew a line on a map of the new American holdings for Britain. That line stretched all the way down the western tip of the Appalachian Mountains, from the Great Lakes to the north of the Gulf of Mexico in the south. And that line was to represent an invisible border that separated Britain's colonies from Britain's allies among the Indians. And the colonists were not to go west of it, and the Indians were not to go east of it. Now, the problem, of course, was how to enforce that line. As the historian Joseph Ellis, he's one of my favorite historians from this time period, he writes, the most important fact about the proclamation of 1763, that's what this was called, was that it was a wholly arbitrary and presumptive attempt to impose an unprecedented level of British control over the colonies. In retrospect, the most significant fact was that the proclamation could be completely ignored. And that's what happened. The king had imposed upon what his subjects could and could not do without letting them have any say in the matter. And that imposition, that rule, was simply dismissed. It would take thousands of British soldiers to enforce this invisible border in America, and that wasn't going to happen. And so the colonists slowly began to awake to the fact they didn't have to do what the king said, and there was no real consequences if they ignored his proclamation. American hunters and land speculators continued to move westward across the line, and there was hardly ever any consequences for it, particularly from their rulers in England. Then came the Acts of Parliament, spread out over a series of years that reached almost all the way to the American Revolution. These acts were basically taxes, even minor taxes, aimed to recoup at least a portion not only of what England had put out in the French and Indian War, but also since then, to keep Americans safe from pirates in the Atlantic and the Caribbean, and safe from hostile Indian tribes. So the Currency Act, prevented the American colonists from printing their own money. Then came the Sugar Act, a tax on the all-important commodity that came out of the British colonies in the Caribbean. Then came the Stamp Act. Now, the Stamp Act was the most unpopular of all of these, and for good reason. From an economic standpoint, the ability of Parliament to tax the colonists for their own protection, it could be seen at least as reasonable. In fact, the Loyalists, those Americans who remained loyal to the British Parliament and King throughout the era of independence and revolution, they certainly saw it as a reasonable demand from the British. The Stamp Act of 1765 was Britain's first direct tax on the American colonists. It required paid stamps on newspapers, on legal documents, on licenses, on everything, all kinds of printed materials, even like playing cards. You had to get this stamp on it. The Prime Minister, he even made the Americans' version of the tax cheaper. He's trying to accommodate them to some degree here, to a large degree here, really. He made the tax on the Americans cheaper than what other British colonists and what other British people were actually paying during this Stamp Act, during its act. He promised that all proceeds from the tax would stay in the American colonies. But that wasn't good enough, all right? Not for a growing breed of people who classified themselves now as patriots. Now, for all the reasons we've talked about in this episode, in the earlier episode, the fact that an infringement had been put upon the Americans without them having any say in the matter, that was seen as a gross miscarriage of justice. Parliament was taking from the people, taking their property, forcing them to change their way of life without giving the people a voice to speak back. Now, to be clear, there probably was some element of truth to this. The British Parliament had realized too late that they weren't able to enforce their rules. They weren't able to enforce their laws on the colonists in America. If they so chose, the Americans could ignore their rules, just like they chose to ignore the King's invisible border. So these taxes and these acts of Parliament were a means to reassert or to gain the upper hand and take back the power in America over the people that they had lost. Parliament had lost somewhere along the way. It was about more than power, though. It was about economics. But it was also too late. One of the things that we'll see again and again in the story of the American empire as we go through this series is the power of conspiracy theories. Now, I don't know if Americans are more susceptible to these than other cultures and nations, but they sure play a surprisingly big role in our history as a nation over the last 250 years. And we start seeing this right here. Patriot leaders and voices whom the British saw as simple rabble-rousers began to see there was a conspiracy afoot. The Stamp Act and others like them were not simply about taxes. It was about the British Parliament asserting dominance over the American people. And ultimately, if the Americans let them get away with this, they would end up as slaves. That was the real aim of what was going on here, at least in the ideas, in the eyes of these conspiracy theorists. No rabble-rouser or patriot leader, depending on your perspective, was more effective at communicating these assertions than a guy by the name of Samuel Adams. Now, if you want to find an intriguing story, go read up on Sam Adams. This isn't John Adams, another influential figure in America's founding and revolution and the cousin to Sam Adams. You hardly find any pictures of this guy, Sam Adams, in the great portraits of this era. There are hardly any monuments for him. But you'll find it impossible to read a story of the American independence movement without coming across his name. Samuel Adams was the infuriating spark of the American Revolution, a man whose political instincts, his moral certainty, made him one of the most effective agitators in colonial history. He was born in Boston, 1722, and Sam Adams grew up steeped in Puritan ideals of virtue, vigilance, and resistance to tyranny. And as he came of age, he failed as a businessman on multiple fronts. It's actually kind of amazing how many of America's founders were failures in business and other areas of life before they collided with their places in history. But by the 1760s, as Britain tightened its grip on the colonies through the Stamp Act and other moves by the Parliament, Sam Adams emerged as the movement's most relentless organizer, an incendiary whose pen, his voice, and strategy ignited public outrage and transformed scattered grievances into a unified revolutionary cause. I first discovered Sam Adams in a book called The Grand Incendiary when I was in high schools, where I checked it out of a library at that point, and that's when I realized this guy was everywhere. But he understood something few others grasped at the time. Revolutions began not on battlefields, they began in the minds of ordinary people. He saw the power of ideas that we talked about in the last episode, and Sam Adams mastered the art of shaping public opinion. Through essays and pamphlets and newspaper articles, often written anonymously, he framed British policies as deliberate assaults on colonial liberty. He portrayed every tax, every troop movement, or royal decree as part of a coordinated plot to enslave the colonies. And his rhetoric, it was really sharp. It was very moralistic, uncompromising, designed to awaken fear, designed to awaken anger and resolve among the colonists. His greatest innovation was really organizational. When we ask how the Continental Congress came about, this right here is where it starts. Because Sam Adams, he weaponized the committees of correspondence that we looked at in the last episode. The first intercolonial communication network, which spread news, coordinated resistance, and built a shared patriot identity. That's how Sam Adams adopted these things. Prior to these points, these local groups had been representatives of their local towns and cities simply to make communication more effective. But Samuel Adams, he changed that. He helped orchestrate protests, helped orchestrate boycotts and mass meetings, always pushing the public toward bolder actions. And he wasn't a general, he wasn't a statesman of grand speeches. His battlefield, again, was the public mind. His weapon was persuasion. His victory was the transformation of a loyal people into revolutionaries. And without his incendiary genius, that spark of independence might never have caught fire. Now, more radical than the committees of correspondence was his development of the Sons of Liberty. You might be familiar with these guys. In modern parlance, we'd probably refer to the Sons of Liberty as a terrorist group. They weren't as rough or as radical as terrorist groups today, but for their age, they basically operated as the radical element of the independence movement, committing acts of terror and vandalism when necessary. Samuel Adams was the movement's master architect in Boston, which was the heart of the independence movement, and with a rare combination of ideological conviction and organizational genius, he transformed local discontent into a disciplined resistance network. He helped orchestrate protests, mobilized working-class Bostonians, and used newspapers and pamphlets to frame British policies as existential threats to liberty. He understood the power of spectacle. He would hang effigies from liberty trees, he would organize mass meetings that electrified crowds, and he carefully staged demonstrations that always kept the public anger focused and morally charged. And so under his influence, the Sons of Liberty became not just protesters, but a political force capable of shaping public and colonial opinion. Chapters or sales of the Sons of Liberty, they spread beyond Boston. Patrick Henry, operating out of Virginia, he supplied the movement, the independence movement, the patriotic movement, with its fiery philosophical core. Now, Patrick Henry was one of the most electrifying voices of the American independence movement. A self-taught lawyer, his fiery oratory helped transform colonial resistance into a moral crusade. Years later, another Virginian by the name of Thomas Jefferson, they would eventually become political opponents, he and Patrick Henry. And Jefferson, he was no orator. And when pitted against Patrick Henry, he knew there just wasn't a lot he could do there, not even with his own political allies. Referring to Patrick Henry's power, his skill and influence as an orator, Jefferson once said, "What we have to do, I think, is devoutly pray for his death." So it was a joke. Jefferson was not a praying man, but he recognized the enormous power and skills that rested in the talent of speeches with Patrick Henry. Born in 1736 on a modest Virginia farm, Henry grew up surrounded by the rhythms of frontier life, absorbing both the independence of rural culture and the intellectual influence of his educated Scottish-born father. After failed attempts at farming and business, there's that common theme again, he discovered his true gift in the courtroom, a commanding voice that fused legal argument with emotional force. His entry onto the political stage in 1765, he came on right about the time of the Virginia Stamp Act resolves. And so he made this bold declaration that only the colony's own assembly had the right to tax Virginians. His speech defending those resolves, challenging even the authority of Parliament, it shocked conservatives, electrified young radicals. And this was early on in his career, well before the era of independence had fully dawned. So powerful and shocking were Patrick Henry's words that one of the members in the House of Burgess, when he gives this speech, they cried out just instinctively, treason, after Henry gave that speech. And he was right. It was here that Henry first articulated the idea that resistance to tyranny was not only a right, but it was a duty. So throughout the 1770s, Henry became the South's most powerful advocate for liberty. His speeches framed the imperial crisis as a struggle between freedom and servitude, culminating in his legendary 1775 declaration, "Give me liberty or give me death." So as just a side note, as a kid, high school, junior high, somewhere along the lines, I memorized that speech, imagining that at some point it would come in handy. It's never come in handy so far. After a few decades, it hasn't come up yet, but it's still stuck in my mind. It was just a short little paragraph speech, that ends with "Give me liberty or give me death." By the eve of the Revolution, Patrick Henry had become the emotional catalyst of Southern resistance, inspiring ordinary colonists to embrace the cause of independence. He gave the Sons of Liberty a language of righteous defiance. So Henry's oratory framed resistance as a moral duty. It inspired Southern colonies to join the cause, ensuring the movement was not just confined to Boston, to New England. So where Adams organized, Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry ignited. His words carried the emotional voltage that turned fear into courage and hesitation into resolve. And as all of this was happening, the Stamp Act that I mentioned came into play. And the Stamp Act is important to this story, not for what it accomplished, but for its unintended consequences. The act itself was overturned the next year as outrage and outcry against it was just too much. Parliament overturned the Stamp Act, but then passed the Declaratory Act, which pretty much just said, if we want to do that, we could. Because remember, we're in charge and you're not. But thanks to the Patriots and the ideas that were unleashed in America, the mere effort of the Stamp Act had opened Pandora's box, and there was no putting the passions that had been let loose back inside that box, at least not in America. Lines had been crossed by the Patriots. They threw parties. They threw citywide celebrations to commemorate their overturning of the Stamp Act. They felt they had the power, and it had been proven right there in their righteous cause. At the same time, there were lines that had been drawn. There were some British colonies that did not repulse at the Stamp Act. In Canada, in Florida, the Caribbean, they didn't repulse. They didn't push back as much. The Patriots saw the Caribbean colonists as too corrupt to go along with their protests. But this is where the battle lines began to become more defined. The 13 colonies of the mainland America were now beginning to be distinguished from those in Canada and from those in the Caribbean. They would be the ones who would continue on in this story toward American independence. This also hardened the lines on the British side of the story too, by the way. The Stamp Act failed, but that didn't mean that Parliament still didn't need to raise the revenue needed to cover its expenses in the French and Indian Wars and the ongoing protection of the American colonies. So if the Americans wouldn't pay, well, who would? The English people had to pay. They saw their taxes go higher as the Americans celebrated overturning the Stamp Act. It didn't leave a good taste in their mouths, to be sure. And what about all those conspiracies? Was the British Parliament really trying to enslave the Americans? There was an influential writer and thinker in London during this time. His name was Samuel Johnson. He wrote, "Why is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes?" It was a good question, and one that many in England were asking themselves and their American cousins. How can you be complaining of the threat of enslavement when you yourselves have so many African slaves? Who's really the enemy of liberty here? Well, the answer to that question kept getting kicked down the road, and we're going to see that's going to be a problem for sure in the future years. Meanwhile, the overturning of the Stamp Act did very little to quell the growing resistance movement within the colonies. It was beginning to get more defined, more polarized. More moves by Parliament helped shape that and move it along. The Townshend Acts of 1767, they were a series of British laws imposing new import duties on everyday goods like glass, paper, paint, lead, tea. And it was designed by the Chancellor, Charles Townshend. designed to raise revenue and assert Parliament's authority, the act also strengthened customs enforcement and allowed officials to use writs of assistance, broad search warrants, and that really angered the colonists. The two sides were in what would literally become a death grip struggle to determine who was in charge in these colonies. Americans viewed the Townshend Acts as another, or at least the Patriots did, as another form of taxation without representation. And that sparked protests, sparked boycotts, rising tensions in the port cities. It was more evidence to prove the case of the radicals. Parliament could not be satisfied until they had enslaved the colonists. The resistance that they provoked helped unify the colonies and set the stage for the escalating conflict that would ultimately lead to the American Revolution. And it's important also to note that even among the radicals, this struggle was framed as a contest between the American colonists and the British Parliament, not the British king, not yet. At this point, most Americans didn't dare think of independence. They were convinced that George III was simply getting bad counsel from his government, and much of their protest was simply to get his attention, so he would realize what was actually taking place. So a great turning point of this struggle came in 1768. Here, Britain's leader determined they had to bring an end to the imperial crisis in the colonies, and it was time to use some force. British leaders concluded that Massachusetts, especially Boston, had become the epicenter of colonial disorder. So the Townshend Acts had intensified tensions, and when Bostonians harassed customs officers and refused to enforce the new duties, the Crown decided that only a military presence could restore obedience. So in September 1768, 8 years before the Declaration of Independence, mind you, 2 regiments of British regulars marched into Boston, their red coats and fixed bayonets signaling that the government could no longer trust civilian authority to maintain order there. Now, to British officials, the occupation of Boston was necessary. It was a necessary assertion of imperial sovereignty. They believed Boston radicals, especially Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty, were pushing the colony towards rebellion. Troops, they argued, would protect customs officers. It would enforce trade laws. It would remind the colonists that Parliament's authority wasn't an option. This was the law. And so to the people of Boston, however, the occupation was appalling. It was provocative. Colonists saw standing armies as instruments of tyranny, meant for subduing subjects rather than protecting them. The presence of soldiers in the streets, patrolling, drilling, quartered in public spaces, it felt like a military takeover. They were living under martial law. Tensions rose as soldiers competed with laborers for work, clashed with civilians, and embodied everything that colonists feared about British intentions. The occupation, it confirmed their belief that the Crown meant to rule them not by consent, but by force. And so this uneasy coexistence between townspeople of Boston and an estimated 4,000 British troops simmered for 18 months before finally erupting in the Boston Massacre of March 1770. By then, the occupation had done exactly the opposite of what Britain intended. Instead of restoring order, it radicalized Boston and helped push the colonies towards revolution. Now, I'm curious what comes to your mind when you think of the phrase or the event, the Boston Massacre. Chances are, whatever images or facts you have were probably influenced by the great propagandist, none other than Samuel Adams. On the icy evening, March 5th, 1770, a lone British sentry, he was stationed outside the customs house, and he exchanged insults with a group of Bostonian apprentices. Well, that crowd of Bostonians, it swelled. They began hurling snowballs, ice, and debris, and Captain Thomas Preston, he arrived with 7 British soldiers to restore order, but the scene quickly grew even more chaotic. As the crowd pressed closer, shouting, "Fire if you dare," a thrown object, probably a bulk of ice, struck a Private Hugh Montgomery with the British Army. He stumbled, raised his musket, and discharged the first shot. In the confusion that followed, other soldiers fired into the crowd. 5 colonists were killed or mortally wounded, including a mariner by the name of Crispus Attucks. He was a sailor of African and native descent who became the first martyr, by the way, of the American Revolution. Later in this series, I'll release an episode that describes the surprising level of African American involvement in the Revolution and other early American history that seems to have been almost completely disappeared from the history books. But for now, the death of Crispus Attucks and the others that were killed that day, it really marked a day of infamy, in which Samuel Adams quickly named the Boston Massacre. Now, in fact, the event might have remained just a tragic street clash, except for Samuel Adams. With extraordinary political instinct, as he always had, Adams recognized its propaganda potential. He immediately framed the incident as a deliberate, a cold-blooded slaughter by a tyrannical occupying army. Samuel Adams transferred the victims into symbols of British oppression. He ensured Paul Revere's dramatic engraving. It was Paul Revere who made the engraving of this event, showing soldiers firing in a coordinated volley, circulated widely, even though it actually distorted the real scene of what actually happened there. So Sam Adams's narrative spread across the colonies, fueled outrage, unified resistance. By shaping the massacre into a moral indictment of British rule, he turned a chaotic street fight into a foundational myth of the patriot cause. Without his propaganda genius, the Boston Massacre would never have carried such revolutionary force. And if the Boston Massacre further polarized the Americans, the Boston Tea Party did the same for the British. Strangely, this event had hardly anything to do with independence or even a British desire for controlling the colonies. It was more about saving one of the great British corporations that had become too big to fail. At least, that's the origin point. The roots of the Boston Tea Party lay in the financial collapse of the British East India Company. That was a massive trading corporation whose mismanagement and global conflicts left it burdened with unsold tea and right on the verge of bankruptcy. Well, to rescue the company, too important to fail, Parliament passed the Tea Act of 1773, and it allowed the company to sell tea directly to the colonies at reduced prices. Although the act actually made tea cheaper, all right, keep that in mind, tea is being made cheaper for the colonists, but the colonists recognized the deeper danger. Accepting the tea meant accepting Parliament's right to tax them. When you look at all the facts on the ground, it's genuinely kind of insane to consider all of this. The colonists were paying less for their tea, but it's the principle of the matter, right? We also have to keep in mind that one of the key losers of this Tea Act was John Hancock. Now, John Hancock was a bit of a dandy, a rich man who made his money through shipping and probably through a bit of smuggling. You probably recognize his name. It's the biggest signature on the Declaration of Independence. Hancock imagined himself as one of the most important players in the independence movement. And he was honestly a bit shocked when it was George Washington rather than himself that became the father of the country. So Boston became the flashpoint for the Tea Act, as was usually the case. Governor Thomas Hutchinson determined to enforce imperial authority, and he refused to let the tea ships depart without unloading their cargo. Now, interesting side note, I think I've mentioned this in an earlier episode, but this Governor Hutchinson, he's framed as the arch nemesis of Samuel Adams in a lot of the history. He was a descendant of the famous Anne Hutchinson, the woman who helped start Rhode Island when the Puritans kicked her out of Boston. We talked about her a few episodes back. Anyway, so Samuel Adams helps organize this mass meeting at the Old South Meeting House, where thousands demanded the tea on these ships had to be returned to England. When Governor Hutchinson refused, Sam Adams signaled this meeting can do nothing more to save the country. That was a phrase widely understood as a cue for direct action. And that night, a group of roughly 100 men, many associated with the Sons of Liberty, including figures like Paul Revere, Joseph Warren, Thomas Young, these guys disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians and boarded the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver ships. Working with disciplined efficiency, they dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. Now, this may seem like a simple act of vandalism, but it was more than that. The impact in Britain was explosive. Many Britons were just outraged by this whole affair. They viewed the destruction of private property as criminal vandalism rather than political protest. Public opinion hardened, and Parliament responded with the coercive or intolerable acts designed to punish Massachusetts and reassert control. The coercive acts of 1774, known in America as the Intolerable Acts, these were Britain's harsh punishment for the Boston Tea Party. Parliament closed the port of Boston, revoked Massachusetts charter, restricted town meetings, and allowed royal officials accused of crimes to be tried not in Boston, but in Britain now. The Quartering Act was strengthened. It permitted troops to be housed more easily in the colonies. They could just go into a stranger or to a Bostonian's house and take up residence. Britain intended these measures to isolate, to discipline the people of Massachusetts, but the effect was the opposite. Colonists saw the act as proof. Here's the proof of all these conspiracies, proof of a plot to crush their liberties. And it sparked outrage, it sparked unity, and the calling of the First Continental Congress. Now, I'm going to pause right here, because now the colonists are about to jump off the cliff. The Imperial crisis is about to end, and the drive towards independence in the American colonies is about to begin. So I want to give plenty of room to cover all of that in our next episode. I'm J.B. Shreve. You're listening to The Empire, a 250-year American story from the end of history. Be sure go ahead to the website and check out the loads of supporting posts and content relating to this podcast series, not to mention dozens of past podcast series that we've done. We'll be back soon with the next episode in our series. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks for listening to The End of History with J.B. Shreve. Check out more episodes at iTunes and wherever you download quality podcasts. Join us online at theendofhistory.net for articles and essays from the end of history. Follow JB on Twitter at JB_Shreve. The End of History is produced by Windmill Media.